The millionaire's daughter fell in love with a humble farmer, and her father threatened him. What the farmer did brought the millionaire to his knees. Harper Carter stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of her penthouse apartment, gazing down at the glittering skyline of Manhattan. The city stretched endlessly before her, a breathtaking maze of ambition, power, and wealth. Everything her father, Edward Carter, had built over the years, from this height. The world seemed small, almost insignificant, and yet, despite the beauty of it all, Harper felt empty. A hollow ache sat deep in her chest, one she had learned to ignore. It wasn't a physical pain, but rather the unsettling feeling that she was simply drifting through life, playing a role she never chose. She exhaled slowly and turned away from the window, her designer heels clicking softly against the marble floor. Tonight was yet another gala, another evening of forced smiles and conversations that revolved around numbers, investments, and real estate. She knew her place, standing beside her father, nodding at the right moments, and making herself agreeable to the wealthy men who wanted a piece of the Carter empire. "Harper, you're not even dressed yet," came a familiar voice from the doorway. She turned to see her father standing there, his expression calm but expectant. Edward Carter was a man who never needed to raise his voice. His presence alone was enough to command a room. His success built not on kindness, but on precision and strategy. "I'm not in the mood for another one of these events, Dad," Harper said, folding her arms across her chest. "Can't I just skip this one?" Edward arched a single brow. "Skip? You know how important tonight is?" "William will be there." Harper clenched her jaw. William Bradford. The name alone made her stomach tighten. For the past year, her father had been subtly, and not so subtly, pushing her toward William. He was the perfect match on paper. Young, successful, and already wealthy in his own right. A rising star in the real estate world. He had the right pedigree, the right connections. He was everything Edward Carter wanted in a future son-in-law. But to Harper, he was nothing more than another suit in a sea of businessmen. A man who saw her not as a person, but as an asset. "I'm not interested in William," she said firmly. Edward let out a slow breath, as if he were dealing with a child. "You're being dramatic, Harper. William is a good man, a smart choice. A safe choice," she countered. Edward set his whiskey glass down with a quiet clink. "You don't get to live life on whims, Harper. The world doesn't work that way. We build our future through careful decisions. Not fleeting emotions now. Get dressed. You have a role to play." Harper swallowed back the frustration bubbling inside her. She had spent her whole life playing roles. Dutiful daughter, poised socialite, heir to the Carter legacy. And yet, none of it felt like her. As her father left the room, she stared at her reflection in the mirror. She looked perfect, as always. Perfectly styled, perfectly composed, and perfectly trapped. The gala was held at an exclusive rooftop venue, filled with New York's elite. Crystal chandeliers reflected the golden glow of the city skyline, and the soft hum of live jazz played in the background. Harper moved through the crowd with practiced ease, exchanging polite smiles and mindless pleasantries. She had mastered this performance years ago. Laugh at the right jokes, nod at the right moments, pretend to care about corporate mergers and stock portfolios. William found her within minutes, flashing his signature confident grin. "You look stunning tonight," he said smoothly, offering her a glass of champagne. "Thank you," she replied, taking the glass but barely sipping from it. He leaned in slightly. "Your father and I were just discussing expanding some of his properties in Vermont. There's a lot of potential there, you know. Beautiful landscapes, untouched land, perfect for development." Harper forced a smile, but her mind was elsewhere. Vermont. She had never set foot there, but the thought of untouched land, away from the suffocating skyscrapers and endless networking events, intrigued her. It was ridiculous. She knew that. What could she possibly find in Vermont? And yet, the idea of a place untouched by the exhausting expectations of her life, it called to her. She barely heard William continue talking, his voice blending into the background noise of the party. Something inside her whispered that she needed to escape, just for a while. The next morning, Harper sat across from her father in his private office, her decision already made. "I want to go to Vermont," she said. Edward barely looked up from his papers. "Why?" You said you were working on a development project there. I want to see it firsthand." He studied her for a moment, eyes narrowing slightly. "I didn't take you for the type to care about rural developments." Harper lifted her chin. "Maybe it's time I did." Edward leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers against the desk. He was silent for a beat before nodding. "Fine, but don't waste your time. This is business, not a vacation." Harper didn't argue. She had no intention of making this a vacation. She just needed air, a break from the endless expectations pressing down on her. Maybe Vermont was exactly what she needed. Later that night, as she packed a suitcase, Harper's mind buzzed with restless energy. For the first time in a long time, she was doing something purely because she wanted to. She wasn't sure what she would find in Vermont, but she knew one thing for certain. She was tired of living inside a golden cage, and she was finally ready to open the door. The drive to Vermont was supposed to be simple. Just a few hours upstate, a quick visit to one of her father's development sites, and then back to the city. That was the plan. But plans had never really been Harper Carter's specialty. She had left Manhattan before dawn, her sleek black Mercedes cutting through the quiet morning streets. The further she drove, the more the city skyline faded into the rearview mirror, replaced by rolling hills and open skies. At first, she welcomed the change. It was a relief to be away from the suffocating high-rises and the constant hum of traffic. The air smelled fresher. The space felt endless. For once, she could breathe. But by late afternoon, storm clouds had gathered overhead, thick and ominous. The temperature dropped sharply, and the narrow rural roads twisted through dense woods, making her uneasy. The GPS signal had flickered in and out for the past hour, and her father's assistant had warned her about an approaching storm before she left. Of course, she hadn't listened. Now, as heavy raindrops pounded against the windshield, Harper tightened her grip on the steering wheel. The road was barely visible beneath the downpour, the headlights doing little to cut through the gray haze. This was a mistake, she muttered under her breath. She should have just let her father's team handle the project. This wasn't her world. Dirt roads, rainstorms, and getting lost in the middle of nowhere. Her phone buzzed from the passenger seat, lighting up with a message from Edward. Edward Carter. "Storm's getting bad. Where are you?" Harper exhaled through her nose and tapped a quick reply. "Harper, almost there. It's fine." It wasn't fine. As if on cue, the tires hit a deep puddle, and the car jerked violently to the side. Harper's heart leaped into her throat as she fought to regain control. But the road was slick, and the back wheels skidded out from under her. Shit! The Mercedes spun off the pavement, sliding down a muddy embankment before slamming to a stop against the base of a towering oak tree. For a few seconds, everything was silent, except for the hammering of rain and Harper's own rapid breathing. The car's engine sputtered, then died completely. She sat there, gripping the wheel with white knuckles, her pulse pounding in her ears. She had crashed. Fantastic. She squeezed her eyes shut for a moment before forcing herself to move, testing her limbs. Nothing broken, just rattled. The dashboard lights flickered, then went dark. She tried the ignition once, twice. Nothing. "Of course," she muttered, slamming her hands against the wheel, her phone. She snatched it up, but there was no signal. "Are you kidding me?" The storm roared outside, wind rattling the windows. She needed help, but help was miles away, and she had no idea where the hell she even was. Harper took a shaky breath and scanned her surroundings. Through the rain-streaked glass, she spotted a faint glow in the distance. A porch light, a house. She grabbed her coat, pushed the door open, and stepped out into the storm. By the time she reached the house, she was drenched. The rain had soaked through her designer trench coat. Her hair clung to her face, and her heels were completely useless in the mud. She was freezing and thoroughly miserable by the time she reached the wooden steps of the wraparound porch. She hesitated for a split second before knocking on the door. A few seconds later, the door swung open, revealing a man. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and definitely not the type of person Harper was used to dealing with. Dressed in worn jeans and a fitted gray Henley, he looked like someone who had spent his entire life outdoors. His dark hair was damp, as if he had been out in the rain himself, and his sharp green eyes studied her with mild surprise and something close to amusement. "Didn't expect company in the middle of a storm," he said, voice deep and even. Harper straightened her shoulders, trying to regain some semblance of composure. I had an accident. My car slid off the road. No signal. I need to call for help." The man glanced past her, toward the road, then back at her. "You're not from around here." It wasn't a question. "No," Harper admitted, wrapping her arms around herself. "I was on my way to—" She hesitated. It wasn't like he would care about some real estate project. "Just passing through." His gaze lingered on her expensive coat, the way she shivered in her designer clothes, completely out of place on his porch. Then, after a beat, he sighed and stepped back. "Come inside. You're gonna freeze to death out here." Harper didn't argue. She stepped inside, grateful for the immediate warmth of the house. It smelled like wood and coffee, the air thick with the comforting scent of a fireplace. The interior was simple, rustic but well kept. Wooden beams stretched across the ceiling, and a well-worn leather couch sat near the crackling fire. The man walked past her, grabbing a towel from a nearby chair and holding it out. "Here. Thanks," she said. Taking it, he leaned against the counter, crossing his arms as he watched her. "So, who are you?" "Harper," she said, rubbing the towel over her soaked hair. "Harper Carter." Something flickered across his face at the name, but it was gone before she could place it. "You live here alone?" she asked, glancing around. "Yeah. You have a phone I can use." He nodded toward the kitchen. "Landline, but the storm knocked out the lines a few hours ago. No service until morning, at least." Harper blinked. "So, I'm stuck here. Unless you plan on walking back to town in that storm." She exhaled through her nose, rubbing her temples. "Great. Stranded in some stranger's cabin in the middle of nowhere. Her father was going to lose his mind. The man must have sensed her frustration because his lips quirked in amusement. "Relax, city girl," he said. "I don't bite." Harper shot him a look. "That's not reassuring." For the first time, he actually smiled. "Name's Owen," he said. "Owen Miller." Harper didn't know it yet, but her entire life had just changed. Harper Carter was not used to being stranded. She was used to luxury, to control, to situations being handled with a single phone call. Not this. Not standing in the middle of a stranger's rustic cabin. Drenched, freezing, and completely at his mercy, Owen Miller leaned against the kitchen counter, arms crossed, watching her with that same unreadable expression. His presence filled the space, not in an overwhelming way, but in a solid, unshakable one. He was clearly a man grounded in his world, in sharp contrast to Harper, who had spent her entire life drifting between places that never felt like home. "You should change," Owen said, nodding toward her soaked clothes. "You're shivering." Harper stiffened. "I'm fine. Suit yourself," he said with a shrug. He moved toward a small hallway and disappeared for a few moments before returning with a clean flannel shirt and a pair of sweatpants. He held them out. "They'll be big, but at least they're dry." Harper hesitated, eyeing the clothes as if they might bite. "I'm not wearing that." Owen exhaled through his nose, amused but clearly unimpressed. "Then stay wet. Up to you." Her teeth chattered involuntarily, betraying her, annoyed with herself, and with him. She snatched the clothes from his hands. "Fine. Where's the bathroom?" He jerked his head toward a door near the back of the house. Harper muttered a thank you and disappeared inside. The moment she shut the door, she let out a long, frustrated breath. The bathroom was small, but clean. White towels neatly folded, a simple mirror above the sink. It smelled like soap and cedar wood, an oddly comforting combination. She peeled off her soaked designer coat, her silk blouse clinging to her skin. This entire situation was surreal. Less than 12 hours ago, she had been in a penthouse in Manhattan. Now she was stuck in some backwoods farmhouse with a man who looked like he belonged in a lumberjack commercial. Slipping into the borrowed clothes, she scowled at her reflection. The flannel shirt swallowed her whole, and the sweatpants were so loose she had to roll the waistband twice. She looked ridiculous. Sighing, she ran a hand through her damp hair and stepped back into the main room. Owen glanced up from where he stood near the fireplace. His gaze flickered over her for half a second before he went back to stoking the fire. If he found her appearance amusing, he didn't show it. "Better?" he asked. Harper folded her arms. Marginally. His lips twitched slightly, but he didn't comment. Instead, he moved toward the kitchen, You eat. What? Have you eaten? He repeated. Or do rich people survive purely on iced coffee and arrogance? Harper narrowed her eyes. Wow, that's original. He shrugged, unfazed. You hungry or not? She was, but admitting it felt like somehow losing. Owen didn't wait for an answer. He grabbed a pan, cracking a couple of eggs onto it. The smell of butter and sizzling food filled the space, making Harper's stomach betray her with a low growl. Owen smirked. Thought so. Harper rolled her eyes and moved to sit at the small kitchen table. She had been in Michelin-starred restaurants with gold-plated silverware, but right now, the sight of scrambled eggs and toast felt like a feast. Owen placed a plate in front of her and sat across from her with his own. You always take in stranded strangers, she asked, picking up a fork. Only the ones dumb enough to drive in a storm, he said without missing a beat. Harper's glare softened just a little. She took a bite, and to her surprise, it was actually good. Simple, warm, real. She had spent her whole life eating extravagant meals prepared by private chefs. But somehow this was better. They ate in silence for a while, the fire crackling softly in the background. The storm still raged outside, rain pounding against the windows. Finally, Harper set her fork down. You live here alone? Yeah, Owen said simply. No family? His jaw tensed for just a second. Not anymore. She caught the shift in his expression, the brief flicker of something unspoken. And you? He asked, shifting the focus back to her. I take it you're not exactly a Vermont local. Harper smirked slightly. What gave it away? The Mercedes or the fact that I almost died in a puddle? Owen chuckled. The sound deep and real. Both, and the attitude. She huffed. I don't have an attitude. Owen just gave her a look. Harper exhaled, shaking her head. Fine. I'm from New York. My father's in real estate. I was on my way to one of his projects when my car skidded off the road. Owen's expression didn't change, but there was a brief pause. Real estate, huh? Yeah, Harper said, stretching her legs out under the table. You probably haven't heard of him, but his name is Edward Carter. Owen finished for her. Harper blinked, startled. You know him? Owen leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. Everyone around here knows Edward Carter. Something about the way he said it made the air shift. Harper frowned. What does that mean? Owen didn't answer right away. Instead, he stood, grabbing their empty plates and moving toward the sink. Means your old man isn't exactly popular in these parts, he finally said, his voice neutral. Harper stared at him, caught off guard. Why? Owen turned off the faucet, drying his hands on a dish towel. He met her gaze then, something almost unreadable in his green eyes. Guess you'll find out soon enough. For the first time that night, Harper felt cold in a way that had nothing to do with the storm. Harper couldn't shake the way Owen had looked at her after she mentioned her father's name. It wasn't anger exactly, but it wasn't indifference either. It was something in between, a tension she didn't understand, a weight behind his words that made the air in the cabin feel thicker than before. Her father wasn't exactly a saint. She knew that. Edward Carter built his empire on ruthlessness, strategy, and control. But she had never given much thought to how his business deals affected people outside of his world. Until now. Harper pulled the oversized flannel tighter around herself, watching as Owen moved around the kitchen, rinsing dishes in the sink as if their conversation had already ended. But it hadn't. Not for her. You didn't answer my question, she said finally. Owen didn't look at her. Didn't think you really wanted the answer. She frowned. Try me. For a moment, he just stood there, hands gripping the edge of the counter. Then he sighed, turning around and leaning back against it. Edward Carter doesn't just build real estate, he said, his voice even. He takes land, businesses, whatever gets in his way. He sees something he wants, and he finds a way to make it his. Harper's stomach tightened. That's how business works, she said, though the words felt weak even as she said them. Owen let out a humorless laugh. Right business. She narrowed her eyes. If you have a personal grudge against my father, just say it. His gaze darkened slightly, but he didn't rise to her bait. Instead, he crossed his arms, studying her carefully. You ever question where his money comes from? Owen asked. Harper stiffened. Excuse me. You heard me, he said, his tone calm but firm. "Have you ever actually looked into how he made his fortune? How many people had to lose something for him to gain?" Harper felt a sharp pang of defensiveness rise in her chest. She had spent her whole life in Edward Carter's shadow, being told what to do, who to associate with, who to marry, but she had never once questioned how he built his empire, because she had never wanted to. She folded her arms. "I don't need to justify my father's business decisions to She stopped herself before the words "to a farmer" slipped out, but Owen heard it anyway. His expression didn't change, but something in his eyes went colder. "Right," he said, nodding slightly. "Of course." Harper immediately regretted it. She didn't mean it like that. Or maybe she did, in some unconscious way. Maybe there was still a part of her that clung to the world she grew up in, where men like Owen were just background characters, people who existed but never mattered. The realization made her stomach turn. Before she could say anything, Owen grabbed his jacket from the back of a chair and pulled it on. "You can take the guest room tonight," he said. "Storm should be gone by morning." Harper blinked. "Where are you going?" "Checking on the barn," he said, walking to the door. "Try not to burn the place down while I'm gone, city girl." Then he was gone, disappearing into the rain. The house felt strangely quiet without him. Harper wrapped her arms around herself, staring at the door long after it had closed. There was a pull in her chest, an uncomfortable restlessness she couldn't name. She had spent her entire life being surrounded by people, businessmen, assistants, bodyguards, acquaintances. Yet, standing alone in Owen's cabin, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Lonely, with a sigh. She wandered toward the living room, taking in the space properly for the first time. Everything about it was simple, but warm. A wooden shelf lined with old books, a small radio sitting on the mantel, a framed photo of a young boy and a woman, his mother. Harper hesitated before reaching out, running her fingers along the worn edge of the frame. The boy in the picture had Owen's eyes, the same sharp green, filled with something softer back then. Happiness, maybe? She wondered what happened to change that. She was still staring at the photo when the door swung open again, sending a burst of cold air into the room. Owen stepped inside, soaked from the rain. Shaking water from his hair, Harper lifted an eyebrow. "Did you wrestle a bear out there?" He smirked, peeling off his jacket. "No, but one of the fences got knocked down, had to fix it before the horses decided to make a break for it." Harper stared at him. "You have horses." "3, he said, rubbing a towel over his hair. She tilted her head. "You don't seem like a horse person." Owen let out a soft chuckle. "And you don't seem like the type to survive in the woods. But here we are." Harper rolled her eyes but found herself fighting a smile. He hung his jacket by the door and moved toward the kitchen. Grabbing a glass of water, "You should get some sleep," he said. "Long drive back tomorrow." Harper hesitated, then sat on the edge of the couch. "Maybe I don't want to leave just yet," she said without thinking. Owen's hand stilled on the glass. He turned, raising an eyebrow. "No," she shrugged, running her fingers along the armrest. "I mean, I haven't actually seen Vermont, not properly. Maybe I should." Owen studied her, as if trying to figure her out. "You really think your father would be okay with that?" he asked. Harper scoffed. "Who said I care?" Owen gave a small, knowing smile. "You care." Harper hated that he saw right through her. She sighed, running a hand through her hair. "Fine, maybe I do, but I'm tired of caring." Owen didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. "You want to stay a little longer?" he said finally. "Fine, but you should know something first." Harper looked up at him. "Waiting. There's a difference between wanting to escape your life and actually living a different one," he said. "You can't just play tourist here, Harper." The way he said her name made something strange flutter in her chest. "Who said I was playing?" she challenged. Owen smirked slightly. "Guess we'll find out." Harper didn't know it yet, but her entire life was about to change. Harper woke to the sound of rain tapping lightly against the window. The storm had passed. For a moment, she forgot where she was. The bed was too firm, the air too fresh, the faint scent of wood smoke lingering in the room. Nothing like the high thread count sheets and climate-controlled penthouse she was used to. Then it all came back. The crash, the cabin, Owen. She sat up, rubbing a hand over her face. The events of last night felt surreal, but the flannel shirt draped over her shoulders and the unfamiliar creak of the wooden floor beneath her feet were proof enough. Her stomach grumbled. Right. She hadn't eaten much since the eggs last night. She hesitated for a moment before stepping out of the room. The cabin was quiet. The fireplace had burned down to glowing embers, casting a faint warmth over the living room. She found Owen in the kitchen, his back to her, flipping something on the stove. "Morning, city girl," he said, without turning around. Harper rolled her eyes and leaned against the doorway. "Do you always greet people with sarcasm before breakfast?" He smirked. "Only the ones who almost wreck their cars on my land." Harper ignored that and glanced at the counter. Pancakes. Her stomach grumbled again, betraying her. Owen caught it and chuckled. "Sit. You can criticize my cooking after you eat it." Harper hesitated for only a second before moving to the table. The truth was, she was starving. Owen placed a plate in front of her and sat across from her with his own. She took a cautious bite and was surprised to find it good, really good. "You know," she said between bites, "for someone who looks like they eat nails for breakfast, you cook surprisingly well." Owen raised an eyebrow. "That's supposed to be a compliment." "Take it however you want," she said. Smirking, he shook his head but didn't argue. The banter between them felt easy, natural. She hadn't felt that with someone in a long time. The moment didn't last. A knock at the door shattered the quiet, loud, sharp, purposeful Owen's expression darkened before he even stood up. Harper frowned as he moved toward the door and swung it open. A man stood on the porch, broad-shouldered, mid-50s, with a face weathered by years of hard work. His eyes landed on Harper instantly, assessing her with a mix of surprise and suspicion. "Owen," the man said, his voice firm. "Didn't expect to find company here?" Harper straightened. "Company." He said it like she was an intruder. "Morning, Joe," Owen said, his tone carefully neutral. "What's going on?" Joe's gaze flickered between them before settling back on Owen. "Carter's men are in town." Harper's stomach dropped. Owen's expression didn't change, but his fingers curled slightly at his sides. "What do they want?" he asked. "What do you think?" Joe scoffed. "They're asking questions about your land. Rumor is Carter's looking to buy again." Harper felt the weight of those words settle over the room. Her father, she swallowed. Owen turned to look at her then, his green eyes sharp, not angry, but guarded. Joe folded his arms. "She got something to do with this." Harper bristled at the accusation. "Excuse me." Joe ignored her, speaking only to Owen. "Be careful, kid. Carter doesn't make offers. He makes moves." With that, he turned and walked off the porch, leaving an uncomfortable silence in his wake. Harper crossed her arms. "So that was friendly?" Owen exhaled through his nose, running a hand over his jaw. "He's not wrong." Harper stiffened. "Are you seriously blaming me for this?" "Did I say that?" Owen asked, his tone calm but sharp. "You didn't have to." Owen held her gaze for a long moment, before shaking his head and walking back inside. Harper followed. "This has nothing to do with me," she said firmly. Owen set his jaw. "You really believe that?" Harper hesitated. She wanted to argue, to tell him he was being ridiculous, but deep down, she knew better. She knew her father, and Edward Carter never made investments without a plan. For the rest of the morning, the air between them remained tense. Owen busied himself outside, checking the fences and tending to the horses, and Harper found herself wandering the property. It was beautiful. Wide stretches of open land, rolling hills, and trees that stretched high into the sky. There was something peaceful about it, something that made her chest feel lighter. She could see why Owen fought so hard to keep it, and she could see why her father wanted it. This was real estate gold, untouched, unclaimed, and ripe for development. No wonder Edward was circling. The thought made her feel sick. She was standing by the barn when she heard Owen approach behind her. "You staying in town?" he asked. Harper turned. "I don't know yet." Owen nodded, as if he had already expected that answer. "You should, if you want to see what your father's really doing here." Harper frowned. "You think I don't know?" Owen met her gaze. "I think you know what he tells you." That hit harder than it should have. Harper pressed her lips together. "And what exactly do you think he's doing?" Owen let out a breath, glancing toward the land stretching behind them. "Destroying everything that's left of this place." Harper's stomach twisted. For years, she had accepted her father's business deals as just that. Business. She had never thought about what those deals actually meant. But Owen had, because he lived it. Harper took a slow breath. "If I stay, will you show me?" Owen studied her for a long moment. Then, finally, he nodded. "Yeah," he said. "I'll show you everything." And just like that, Harper knew she wasn't going back to New York anytime soon. Harper had never questioned her father's world before. Not really. She had lived in penthouses, dined in Michelin-starred restaurants, worn designer clothes without thinking twice. The Carter Empire had been built around her, and she had walked through it effortlessly, never needing to stop and wonder who had to lose for her family to win. But Owen Miller was making her see it. And now, she couldn't unsee it. She spent the next 2 days in Owen's world, waking up to the golden sunrise stretching over the open fields, drinking coffee that didn't come from an overpriced cafe, listening to the distant sound of horses in the barn. There were no emails, no scheduled meetings, no assistants waiting on her every move. Just life, real and unfiltered. And for the first time in a long time, Harper felt like a person, not an asset. Not Edward Carter's daughter, just Harper. She had thought she would hate it, but instead, she found herself watching the way Owen worked, how he moved through his land like it was an extension of him, how he knew every inch of it by heart, and something about that unsettled her, because she had never felt that kind of belonging anywhere. Owen didn't talk much about the past, but Harper could feel it lingering in his silences. He took her to the edges of the property, where the fences stretched out into the tree line, land that had once belonged to his family. "You see that ridge over there?" he asked, nodding toward the distant horizon. Harper followed his gaze. "Yeah, used to belong to my grandfather," he said simply. She turned to look at him. What happened? Owen didn't answer right away. Instead, he let out a slow breath. "Your father happened." Harper felt her stomach twist. She wanted to argue, to tell him that Edward Carter wasn't a thief, that he was just a businessman, that deals were just deals. But something stopped her, because she wasn't sure if she believed that anymore. That night, Harper sat on the porch, staring out at the stars. It was strange, how different everything felt here. The city was never quiet. It was always moving, always demanding something from her. But here, the world breathed. Owen came outside a few minutes later, 2 beers in hand. He handed one to her without a word before sitting down on the steps beside her. Harper hesitated before taking a sip. She wasn't really a beer kind of girl, but she could make an exception. They sat in silence for a while, the cool night air settling around them. "You ever think about leaving?" she asked eventually. Owen exhaled through his nose. "No, never. This is home," he said simply. "Not something I'm looking to run from." Harper looked down at the bottle in her hands. "That's the difference between us." She had spent her entire life running from things, expectations, responsibilities, herself. Maybe that's why she didn't want to leave Vermont, because for once, she wasn't running. The next morning, Harper's phone rang. She didn't want to answer it, but she did. Edward Carter's voice was sharp, clipped. "Where the hell are you?" Harper took a slow breath. "Still in Vermont." Silence. Then, "I sent a driver. He's waiting for you in town. You're coming home." Harper's grip tightened around the phone. "I'm not ready to leave yet." Edward's tone hardened. "Harper, this is not up for discussion." She closed her eyes. She had never defied him before. Not really. Not in a way that actually mattered. But now, she wasn't sure she could go back. Not after this. Not after Owen. "I'll call you later," she said. Then she hung up. Her heart pounded for the first time in her life. She had made a choice. And for the first time, it was hers. Owen was fixing a fence when she found him. He looked up at her, wiping sweat from his brow, eyes sharp and questioning. She took a breath. "I'm staying." Owen didn't look surprised. "Yeah," he said. "I figured." She narrowed her eyes. "You figured." His lips twitched. "Didn't seem like you were made for the city." "After all," Harper huffed. "Oh, please. You were ready to bet money that I'd run back to New York the second my father called." Owen smirked. "And yet, here you are." Harper rolled her eyes, but there was no real annoyance behind it, because he was right. Here she was, and she wasn't leaving. Harper had never truly questioned her father's world before. Not really. She had grown up surrounded by luxury, privilege, and control. Every aspect of her life had been carefully curated. Her education, her friendships, even the men she was expected to date. Edward Carter dictated everything, and she had never resisted until now. Because now, she was seeing things differently. And the worst part, she couldn't unsee them. She spent the next few days in Owen's world, waking up to golden sunrises stretching over the open fields, drinking coffee that didn't come from an overpriced cafe, listening to the distant sound of horses in the barn. There were no emails, no scheduled meetings, no assistants waiting on her every move. Just life, real and unfiltered. And for the first time in a long time, Harper felt like a person, not an asset, not Edward Carter's daughter, just Harper. She had thought she would hate it, but instead, she found herself watching Owen work, how he moved through his land like it was an extension of him, how he knew every inch of it by heart, and something about that unsettled her, because she had never felt that kind of belonging anywhere. Owen didn't talk much about the past, but Harper could feel it lingering in his silences. One afternoon, he took her to the edges of the property, where the fences stretched out into the tree line, land that had once belonged to his family. "You see that ridge over there?" he asked, nodding toward the distant horizon. Harper followed his gaze. "Yeah, used to belong to my grandfather," he said simply. She turned to look at him. "What happened?" Owen didn't answer right away. Instead, he let out a slow breath. "Your father happened." Harper felt her stomach twist. She wanted to argue, to tell him that Edward Carter wasn't a thief, that he was just a businessman, that deals were just deals. But something stopped her, because she wasn't sure if she believed that anymore. That night, Harper sat on the porch. Staring out at the stars, it was strange, how different everything felt here. The city was never quiet. It was always moving, always demanding something from her. But here, the world breathed. Owen came outside a few minutes later, 2 beers in hand. He handed one to her without a word before sitting down on the steps beside her. Harper hesitated before taking a sip. She wasn't really a beer kind of girl, but she could make an exception. They sat in silence for a while, the cool night air settling around them. "You ever think about leaving?" she asked eventually. Owen exhaled through his nose. "No, never. This is home," he said simply. "Not something I'm looking to run from." Harper looked down at the bottle in her hands. That's the difference between us. She had spent her entire life running from things, expectations, responsibilities, herself. Maybe that's why she didn't want to leave Vermont, because for once, she wasn't running. Owen turned his head slightly, studying her. "You ever thought about staying somewhere like this?" Harper let out a soft laugh. "What, on a farm?" He smirked. "Yeah, wouldn't kill you, city girl." She rolled her eyes, but found herself smiling. "I think it would, actually. Can you imagine me waking up at dawn to milk cows?" Owen chuckled. "You'd complain about it every day, but you'd do it." Harper tilted her head. "What makes you so sure?" "Because you don't quit as easily as you think you do," he said, his voice quieter now. "If you did, you'd already be back in New York." The way he said it made something strange flutter in her chest. She looked at him then, really looked at him. The flickering light from the porch lamp cast shadows along his jaw, highlighting the strong, defined lines of his face. He was handsome, but it wasn't just that. It was the way he felt steady in a world that always seemed to shift under her feet. Harper looked away, exhaling slowly. "I should probably get some sleep." Owen nodded. "Yeah, long day tomorrow." She stood, hesitating for just a second before turning toward the door. "Good night, Owen." "Good night, Harper." The next morning, Harper's phone rang. She didn't want to answer it, but she did. Edward Carter's voice was sharp, clipped. "Where the hell are you?" Harper took a slow breath. "Still in Vermont." Silence. Then, "I sent a driver. He's waiting for you in town. You're coming home." Harper's grip tightened around the phone. "I'm not ready to leave yet." Edward's tone hardened. "Harper, this is not up for discussion." She closed her eyes. She had never defied him before. Not really. Not in a way that actually mattered. But now, she wasn't sure she could go back. Not after this. Not after Owen. I'll call you later, she said. Then she hung up. Her heart pounded. For the first time in her life. She had made a choice. And for the first time, it was hers. Owen was fixing a fence when she found him. He looked up at her, wiping sweat from his brow, eyes sharp and questioning. She took a breath. I'm staying. Owen didn't look surprised. Yeah, he said. I figured. She narrowed her eyes. You figured. His lips twitched. Didn't seem like you were made for the city. After all, Harper huffed. Oh, please. You were ready to bet money that I'd run back to New York the second my father called. Owen smirked. And yet, here you are? Harper rolled her eyes. But there was no real annoyance behind it. Because he was right, here she was. And she wasn't leaving. She took a step closer. You going to show me how things really work around here? Owen's expression softened slightly. Guess I don't have much of a choice now. Harper smiled. And for the first time in a long time, it felt real. Harper woke up to the sound of birds outside her window. It was a foreign sound. She was used to waking up to the hum of city traffic, to the sound of horns blaring in the distance, to the mechanical beeping of her alarm clock forcing her into another meticulously planned day. But here, there was only silence, a peaceful kind of quiet, the kind that made her chest feel lighter. For a moment, she just lay there, staring at the wooden ceiling. The soft glow of morning light slipping through the curtains. She wasn't supposed to be here. She was supposed to be back in New York, attending meetings she didn't care about, smiling at people she barely tolerated, living a life that had been planned for her since birth. Instead, she was here, in Owen Miller's house, and she had never felt more like herself. When she walked into the kitchen, Owen was already there, making coffee. He glanced up when he saw her, his expression unreadable. Morning, morning, she echoed, running a hand through her hair. She suddenly felt aware of how different she must look. No designer clothes, no perfectly styled hair, no polished image to maintain, just a borrowed flannel shirt and sweatpants that weren't hers. Owen poured her a cup of coffee without asking if she wanted one. Harper smirked. You're not going to ask how I take it. Owen leaned against the counter, taking a sip of his own. You seem like the type who likes it complicated, but I'm not making a caramel whatever for you, city girl. She rolled her eyes, but took the cup anyway. I can survive black coffee, probably. Owen's lips twitched like he was holding back a smile. They stood in silence for a moment, sipping their coffee. Until Harper finally said, I'm not going back. Owen studied her for a beat, then nodded. Figured. She frowned. You keep saying that, like you already knew what I was going to do before I did. Owen shrugged. Didn't take a genius to see you weren't happy in that world. Harper bit her lip. He wasn't wrong. For the first time, she was choosing something for herself, and it terrified her. But what terrified her even more was how much she wanted to stay. The day passed in a blur of work. Owen had told her the night before that if she was serious about staying, she had to learn how things worked. No more watching from the sidelines. So Harper spent the morning following him around, watching him tend to the horses, fix fences, handle deliveries. She had never seen anyone work like that before. Not in New York, not in her world. There, work was about meetings, investments, numbers on a screen. Here, it was tangible. It was sweat and dirt and early mornings. It was real. You ever actually worked a day in your life? Owen teased as she struggled to stack hay bales. Harper shot him a glare. I run in heels on marble floors daily, that counts. Owen chuckled. Not the same, city girl. She huffed, wiping sweat from her forehead. Yeah, no kidding. But the truth was, she liked it. The feeling of doing something, of using her hands, of being part of something that wasn't just about money and power. And Owen had stopped looking at her like she didn't belong. Now, when he glanced her way, there was something different in his eyes, something dangerous. That night, Harper sat outside again, her body aching from muscles she hadn't even known existed. Owen joined her a few minutes later, carrying 2 beers like he had the night before. They sat in silence for a while, just watching the stars. Then Harper said, Why do you hate my father so much? Owen didn't answer right away. He took a slow sip of his beer, his jaw tightening. He took everything from my family, he said finally. Harper swallowed. What do you mean? Owen exhaled. My grandfather owned half the land Carter built his first development on. The deal was supposed to be fair, but it wasn't. My grandfather lost everything. My dad spent his life trying to hold on to what little we had left. And now, Carter's still trying to take the rest. Harper felt something heavy settle in her chest. She had always known her father was ruthless in business, but this was different, because it wasn't just business. It was personal. And suddenly, Harper wasn't sure which side she was on anymore. Owen turned to look at her then, his green eyes sharp, searching. "You still think I'm wrong?" he asked. Harper shook her head slowly. No, she wasn't sure she had ever said no to Edward Carter before. But now, sitting here with Owen, feeling the weight of his words, she knew she couldn't defend her father anymore. Because for the first time, she wasn't sure if she really knew him at all. Owen was still looking at her, something unreadable in his gaze. Harper's heart pounded. She should look away. She should say something. She should leave. But she didn't, because something between them had shifted, and before she could stop herself, she leaned in, just slightly, just enough to feel the warmth of his breath, to see the way his eyes flickered down to her lips. Owen tensed. For a second, she thought he was going to pull away, but then, he didn't. His hand came up, brushing against her cheek, soft, tentative, and then finally, he kissed her. Slow at first, testing, then deeper, stronger. Harper melted into it. For the first time in her life, nothing else mattered. Not New York, not her father, not the war brewing between them. Just this. Just him. When they finally pulled away, Harper's breath was unsteady. Owen was looking at her like he wanted to say something. But before he could, his phone rang. His expression darkened as he checked the screen. Harper frowned. "Who is it?" Owen hesitated. Then, finally, he looked at her. "It's about your father." Harper's stomach dropped, because suddenly, she knew, whatever came next. Everything was about to change. The moment Owen said, "It's about your father," Harper's world snapped back into focus. She had been floating, lost in the warmth of his touch, in the way his lips had felt against hers, in the quiet moment where nothing else mattered. But now, reality had come crashing back in. Owen stood, phone still in his hand, his jaw clenched tight. Harper swallowed. "What is it?" Owen exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Joe just called. Carter's men are in town again, and they're not just asking questions anymore." Harper felt her stomach twist. She knew this would happen. Her father didn't lose, and he didn't like being defied. "What do you mean?" she asked, standing up. Owen's green eyes met hers, sharp and unreadable. "They're talking to landowners, pressuring them to sell, offering more money than these people have ever seen, just to get them to sign their land over before they know what's happening." Harper's breath hitched. Her father was moving in, and she had no doubt that if money didn't work, he would find another way. Owen's expression hardened. "This isn't just business, Harper. Your father is trying to wipe out the last piece of this town that he doesn't own." Harper took a shaky breath. "I didn't know." Owen's jaw tensed. "But you're not surprised, are you?" She hesitated. No, she wasn't. Because deep down, she knew what her father was capable of. And yet, standing here now, hearing it from Owen, she felt something break inside her. "Harper," Owen said, his voice quieter now, "you need to decide whose side you're on." Her pulse pounded, because for the first time in her life, she wasn't sure. They drove into town early the next morning. The air was tense, heavier than usual. Harper could feel it in the way people glanced toward her, in the hushed conversations that stopped when she passed. They knew. They knew she was Edward Carter's daughter, and that meant she was the enemy. Owen parked the truck in front of the diner, but before they could step inside, a familiar voice called out, Well, look what the storm dragged back in." Harper turned to see William Bradford, her father's golden boy, the man she was supposed to marry. Her stomach twisted. She had forgotten how much she hated his smirk. William's eyes flicked to Owen, sizing him up before turning back to her. "I have to admit, Harper, I didn't think you'd last this long playing the country girl." Harper squared her shoulders. "What are you doing here, William?" William smiled, all teeth. "Business, of course. You didn't really think your father would let you run off without consequences, did you?" Harper's heart pounded. Owen took a step forward. If you've got something to say, say it. William didn't even look at him. His eyes were locked on Harper. You know your father, Harper, he said smoothly. He doesn't take disobedience lightly, and he sure as hell doesn't like being embarrassed. Harper's fingers curled into fists. This was a warning, a thinly veiled threat, and she knew exactly what came next. Tell my father I'm not coming back, she said, her voice steady. He can't control me anymore. William sighed dramatically. Come on, Harper, you don't belong here. You're a Carter, and Carters don't— Enough! The word was sharp, final, and it didn't come from Harper. It came from Owen. William finally turned to look at him, his smirk faltering for the first time. Owen's expression was deadly calm. His posture relaxed, but his eyes were burning. She said she's not coming back, Owen said. So I suggest you listen. For a moment, William didn't move. Then he chuckled. Oh, this is adorable. You really think she's going to stay here? That she's going to trade the Carter Empire for a life-shoveling horse shit? Harper took a step forward. You don't know anything about me. William's smirk returned. Don't I? Harper's pulse pounded. He was trying to get under her skin, to make her doubt herself, but she wasn't that girl anymore. So she did something that shocked even herself. She took Owen's hand, laced their fingers together, held on tight, and then she looked William dead in the eye. I'm not leaving, she said, and there's nothing my father can do to change that. For the first time, William looked uncertain, and Harper, she had never felt stronger. They drove back in silence. Harper could still feel the warmth of Owen's hand on hers, even though she had let go as soon as they got in the truck. She didn't know what had possessed her to do it, but she didn't regret it. Owen finally broke the silence. Are you sure about this? Harper exhaled. I have to be. Owen nodded, gripping the steering wheel tighter. Then we fight. Harper turned to look at him. You mean that? Owen's jaw was set, his green eyes burning. Yeah, he said. I mean it. That night, they sat on the porch again. Neither of them spoke for a long time. The stars were out. The air was cool, and for a moment, it felt like nothing had changed. But everything had. You really think we can win? Harper asked quietly. Owen didn't answer right away. Then he turned to her, his expression softer than before. I don't know. Harper swallowed. But you're going to fight anyway. Owen nodded. Yeah. Harper took a shaky breath. Then so am I. And just like that, it was decided. They were in this, together. And whatever came next, they would face it side by side. The decision had been made. Harper and Owen were going to fight. But how do you fight against a man like Edward Carter? Harper had grown up watching her father destroy anyone who got in his way. He didn't just win. He obliterated. He crushed people with legal loopholes, outmaneuvered them with dirty tricks, and when that failed, he bought their silence. Owen knew that, and yet, he wasn't afraid. Harper wished she could say the same. The next morning, they drove into town again. Harper could feel the weight of the stares, the whispers. She wasn't just an outsider anymore. She was a Carter, and that meant trouble. The tension was thick in the diner. Owen barely had time to sit down before Joe, the old rancher who had warned him before, stormed up to their table. You need to fix this, Miller. Harper stiffened, but Owen remained calm. What's going on? Joe slammed a stack of papers onto the table. They're sending contracts to the landowners, Joe growled. They're giving people a choice. Sign now and take the money, or watch as the land value plummets when Carter builds around them. Harper picked up one of the contracts. She recognized the legal jargon. It was a classic Edward Carter tactic. Make the deal look appealing. Make people sign out of fear, then take everything. She felt sick. Owen's hands clenched into fists. How many people have signed? He asked. Joe exhaled, rubbing a hand over his jaw. None yet, but the pressure's getting worse. Your land's next, Owen. Harper felt her chest tighten. It wasn't just a threat. It was a promise. That night, Harper sat on the porch again. Owen sat beside her, silent. She knew what he was thinking, because she was thinking it too. Her father wasn't going to stop. Not until he got what he wanted. I need to talk to him, Harper said suddenly. Owen turned to her, his expression unreadable. You think that'll do anything? Harper swallowed. I don't know, but I need to try. Owen was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded. All right, he said. Let's do it. The next morning, Harper made the call. She expected Edward to ignore it, but he answered on the first ring. Harper, she took a deep breath. We need to talk. Edward was silent for a beat. Then, where? Harper's grip on the phone tightened. She wasn't going to his territory. You want to talk? Come to Vermont, she said. Another pause. Then a slow, cold chuckle. You're making demands now. I'm asking, Harper corrected. One conversation, that's all. Silence then. Finally. Fine. The line went dead. Harper let out a shaky breath. Owen watched her. He's coming. Harper nodded. Yeah. Owen exhaled, leaning against the counter. Then we better be ready. 2 days later, Edward Carter arrived in Vermont. Harper had never seen him here before. It felt wrong. Like something unnatural, he stepped out of a sleek black SUV, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, looking painfully out of place against the backdrop of Owen's land. His gaze swept over the farm with thinly veiled disgust. Then his eyes landed on Harper. She swallowed. He looked the same, but she wasn't. The conversation happened inside. Owen stood by the fireplace, arms crossed. Harper sat across from her father, who looked entirely too comfortable despite the unfamiliar setting. Edward exhaled. So, what is this? Harper's pulse pounded. I want you to stop. Edward tilted his head. Stop what? You know what? She said sharply. Edward smirked. This land is business, Harper. Nothing more. Harper's hands clenched into fists. You don't need it, she said. You already own half the state. Why take this too? Edward studied her for a moment. Then, with slow, deliberate precision, he pulled out a folder. He slid it across the table toward her. Harper hesitated before opening it. Her breath hitched. Inside were documents, legal records, land deeds, and then, near the bottom, a letter, written in her grandfather's handwriting. Harper's hands shook. She barely registered Owen moving closer, looking over her shoulder. What is this? She whispered. Edward leaned back, watching her. This, he said, is the truth. Harper swallowed hard, reading the letter. Her grandfather, Richard Carter. Writing to Owen's grandfather, apologizing for a deal gone wrong, for something that was never meant to happen. Harper's heart pounded. This says the land wasn't supposed to be taken, she said. Edward nodded. Because it wasn't. Harper looked up at him. Then why? Because my father didn't care, Edward said simply. He saw an opportunity, and he took it, and I built an empire from that decision. Harper felt sick. Her entire life. She had believed her family had built something legitimate. But now, sitting here, holding proof that everything was built on a lie, it felt like the floor was collapsing beneath her. Owen hadn't spoken, not once, but Harper could feel the tension radiating off him. His whole life. He had blamed Edward, but the truth was bigger than both of them. The truth had started long before either of them were even born. Edward sighed. So you see, Harper, this isn't personal. It's just history repeating itself. Harper's hands clenched. You don't have to continue it. Edward smiled. But why wouldn't I? Harper stood. Her chair scraped against the wooden floor as she pushed it back, her pulse thunderous. You can't buy me, Dad, she said. And you can't control me. Edward tilted his head, and for the first time she saw it. A flicker of doubt. For the first time, she was no longer the obedient daughter. She was something else entirely. Edward left an hour later. He didn't threaten her. He didn't try to manipulate her. But Harper knew this wasn't over. Because men like Edward Carter didn't just walk away. They regrouped, and they came back stronger. That night, Harper stood outside staring at the sky. Owen found her there, his expression unreadable. You okay? He asked. Harper let out a breath. No. Owen nodded. Then, after a beat, he took her hand. Harper let him, because for the first time she knew. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about legacy. About breaking a cycle, and Harper Carter. She was going to burn it all down. The truth changed everything. Harper had spent her entire life believing in a legacy that never really existed. She had worn the Carter name like a shield, thinking it meant power, stability, success. But now she saw it for what it really was. A lie. And Owen had suffered because of it. The morning after Edward left, the weight of everything crashed down on her. She sat at the kitchen table, staring at the letter her grandfather had written all those years ago. The ink was faded, but the words were still sharp. I never intended for this land to be taken from you. I never intended for this to become what it has, but it had. And now, she was left to fix it. She had no idea how. Owen didn't say much that morning. He was outside working on the fences, pretending everything was fine. But Harper knew it wasn't. She could feel the tension in the air. She could see it in the way he kept his shoulders tight, in the way he avoided looking at her for too long. This wasn't just about her father. This was about his family, about everything that had been stolen from them. And now, she was caught in the middle. By the afternoon, Harper couldn't take the silence anymore. She found Owen in the barn, brushing down one of the horses. "You're mad at me," she said, crossing her arms. Owen didn't look at her. "No, I'm mad at your father." Harper swallowed. "It's not the same thing." Owen stopped, exhaling slowly. Then he turned to face her. For the first time since Edward had left, Harper saw anger in his eyes. "You think I don't know what's coming?" he asked. "You think I don't know that this was just the beginning? Your father's not done, Harper. He never is." Harper felt her stomach twist. "I know that. Do you?" Owen's voice was quiet, but sharp. "Because I need to know, Harper. Are you really on my side? Or are you just trying to make yourself feel better?" The words hit her like a punch. She took a step back. "That's not fair." Owen ran a hand through his hair, frustration clear on his face. "You say you're not like him. Prove it." Harper's breath caught. She had spent her whole life defending Edward Carter. But now she had to fight against him, and she had to decide how far she was willing to go. That night, Harper made a choice. She sat on the porch, staring at the letter one last time. Then she pulled out her phone. Her fingers hovered over the screen before she pressed dial. The call rang twice before a voice answered. "Harper?" It wasn't her father. It was William. Her stomach turned, but she forced her voice to stay even. "I need to talk to you," she said. William was silent for a beat. Then he chuckled. "Oh, now you want to talk. This isn't about me," Harper said. "This is about the land." William sighed. "Harper, you don't get it. Your father isn't going to back down." "I know that," Harper said. "But I need to know. How far is he willing to go?" Another pause. Then William said something that made Harper's blood go cold. "You really want the truth?" "Yes," Harper whispered. William exhaled. "Then meet me tomorrow, noon. But you come alone." The line went dead. Harper stared at her phone, her heart pounding. Because she knew this was a risk, but she also knew she had no other choice. Owen was furious when he found out. "You're meeting him alone?" he asked, his voice sharp. Harper folded her arms. "I need answers." "You don't know what he's going to do," Owen shot back. "What if it's a trap?" Harper swallowed hard. "Then I guess I'll find out." Owen let out a slow breath, running a hand over his jaw. "You don't have to do this," he said quietly. Harper met his gaze. "Yes, I do." Owen stared at her for a long moment. Then finally he sighed. "You're not going alone." Harper frowned. "Owen." "No," he cut her off. I don't care what deal you made. I'm not letting you walk into this alone." Harper wanted to argue, but part of her was relieved, because as much as she wanted to be strong, she didn't want to face this alone. The next day, Harper and Owen drove into town. William was waiting for them outside an abandoned gas station. He raised an eyebrow when he saw Owen. "Not alone, I see." Harper folded her arms. "You expected me to trust you?" William smirked. "Fair point." Owen's posture was tense, his arms crossed as he stood beside Harper. "Talk," Owen said. "What does Carter really want?" William sighed. "The same thing he's always wanted. Everything." Harper clenched her jaw. "So he's going to force people out." William exhaled. "Not just force, destroy." Harper's blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" she asked. William hesitated. Then, reluctantly, he pulled something from his pocket, a USB drive. He handed it to Harper. "You want to know what your father is planning?" "It's all in there," he said. Harper stared at it. Owen narrowed his eyes. "Why are you giving this to us?" William shrugged. "Because I'm not stupid. I know how this ends. Your father wins, I get tossed aside, and the town gets buried under a shopping mall." Harper swallowed. "Maybe," William added. "It's time someone actually stopped him." Harper met Owen's gaze, and in that moment, she knew they had what they needed. And now, it was time to bring Edward Carter down. Harper stared at the USB drive in her hands, her mind racing. This tiny device held the truth. Everything her father had planned. Every underhanded deal, every secret contract, every manipulation. It was all here. She had spent her entire life ignoring the signs, pretending Edward Carter was just a ruthless businessman instead of a man who destroyed lives to get what he wanted. But there was no ignoring this. Not anymore. Because now, she had proof, and she was going to use it. Owen drove them back to the farm in silence. Harper could feel the tension radiating off him, his grip tight on the wheel. He didn't trust William. And honestly, neither did she. But the evidence was real, and that meant they had a chance. "We need to see what's on this," she said, breaking the silence. Owen nodded. "Yeah, but we need to be careful." Harper swallowed. "Because if my father finds out we have it, he'll come after you," Owen finished. She knew that. She had grown up watching her father take down his enemies. Now, she was one of them. They plugged the USB drive into Owen's laptop the moment they got back. Harper's hands trembled as she clicked through the files, legal documents, emails, financial statements. Proof. Her father had been planning this for years. One by one, the pieces fell into place. The false promises, the intimidation tactics, the quiet buyouts disguised as generous offers, and then, the worst part, buried at the bottom of the file was a document labeled Phase 2. Harper clicked on it, and what she saw made her blood run cold. Edward Carter wasn't just forcing people to sell, he was setting them up to fail, raising property taxes in secret, cutting off local suppliers, creating a crisis so severe that people would have no choice but to sell. And the moment they did, he would bulldoze everything, not just Owen's land, the entire town. Harper's breath caught. He's going to wipe everything out. Owen clenched his jaw. And rebuild it into a playground for billionaires. Harper swallowed hard. This isn't just about your family's land anymore. This is about all of them. Owen nodded. Yeah, and now we have to warn them. The town meeting was set for that night. Owen spread the word quickly. By the time they arrived at the small community center, the room was packed. Farmers, business owners, families who had lived in Vermont for generations. All of them waiting. All of them afraid. And Harper had never felt so out of place. She wasn't one of them. She was the enemy's daughter, and they all knew it. Owen stood beside her as they stepped to the front of the room. Joe, the old rancher who had warned them before, narrowed his eyes. "What's this about, Miller?" Owen didn't hesitate. He turned to Harper and let her speak. Harper took a shaky breath, her hands tightening around the USB drive. "My father is planning to destroy this town," she said, her voice steady despite the weight of her words. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some people looked skeptical, others angry. She held up the USB drive. "I have proof." Joe folded his arms. "Why should we believe you?" Harper's chest tightened. She understood why they didn't trust her, but they had to. She turned to Owen. He gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod. So she did the only thing she could. She told them everything. By the time she was done, the room was dead silent. People weren't just angry. They were furious. Owen crossed his arms. "We have two choices. We can sit back and let Carter take everything, or we can fight." The silence stretched. Then Joe stepped forward. His voice was gruff. "What's the plan?" And just like that, the war began. The next few days were a blur of strategy. They gathered every legal loophole they could find, every document they could use against Edward Carter. They contacted the media, the local government, anyone who would listen, and slowly, people started fighting back. But Harper knew it wasn't enough, because her father wasn't just powerful, he was dangerous, and he wasn't going to let this go without a fight. The first attack came 2 days later. Owen's fences were slashed, his barn was vandalized, and a single message was carved into the wood: "Leave." Harper's stomach turned. Owen clenched his jaw. "So it begins." Harper exhaled. We knew this was coming. Owen turned to her. Yeah, but that doesn't mean I have to like it. Harper swallowed hard. I'm sorry. Owen's expression softened. This isn't your fault, Harper. But it is, she whispered. I brought this here. Owen took a step closer, and then another, until he was standing right in front of her. No, he said quietly. Your father did this, not you. Harper looked up at him, and for the first time in days, she let herself breathe, because as long as Owen was standing beside her, she knew they still had a chance that night. Harper couldn't sleep. She stepped outside, staring at the darkened sky, the weight of everything pressed down on her. She had spent so long being her father's daughter. Now she was his enemy, and she didn't know how to stop him. But she had to, because if she didn't, she would lose everything. Owen found her outside an hour later. He didn't say anything at first. He just handed her a cup of coffee. Harper blinked. At midnight. Owen smirked. Figured you could use it. Harper sighed, taking a sip. Then she glanced at him. Do you really think we can win this? Owen didn't answer right away. Then, finally, he said, I think we have to try. Harper exhaled. Yeah, we do. They stood in silence for a long time. The night was calm, but Harper knew it wouldn't last, because Edward Carter wasn't done, and the next time he struck, it would be worse. Harper had known the fight wouldn't be easy, but she hadn't expected it to feel like this. Like waking up every morning and wondering what fresh hell her father would unleash. Like watching fear settle in the eyes of good people who had never asked for this war. Like knowing that, no matter what, she was the reason this was happening. The morning after the barn was vandalized, the threats got worse. First, it was a phone call. No words, just silence. Then, later that afternoon, a black car parked near the farm for hours, just watching. And that night, Owen's truck was trashed. Smashed windows, slashed tires, and another message, spray-painted on the hood. Stop. Harper's stomach dropped. Owen stood next to her, his jaw clenched so tight she thought he might break. She turned to him, voice shaking. Owen, this is getting dangerous. Owen exhaled slowly. It already was. Harper swallowed. We should go to the police. Owen let out a bitter laugh. And say what? That one of the most powerful men in the country is throwing a tantrum because his daughter finally grew a spine. Harper winced. Because he wasn't wrong. Edward Carter's influence stretched far beyond this town. And if the police hadn't stopped him before, they wouldn't stop him now. The town was angry after the meeting. People had been fired up, ready to fight. But now, fear was setting in. The destruction of Owen's truck sent a clear message. Edward Carter wasn't just threatening people. He was punishing them. Joe, gruff, no-nonsense Joe, was the first to voice what everyone was thinking. If we fight, we're signing our own death warrants. Harper's chest tightened. So what? We just give up. Joe's eyes flickered to her, and there it was. That doubt, that resentment, that look that said, "This isn't your fight, girl. You don't belong here." Owen stepped forward. Nobody's giving up, but we need a plan. Harper's hands curled into fists. She had spent her whole life letting things happen, letting her father make decisions for her, letting people assume she was just another Carter, just another pawn in the game. Not anymore. She took a breath, and then she did the one thing that felt natural. She took control. We need the media, Harper said. Owen frowned. What? She turned to him. The one thing my father hates, bad press. He's untouchable in boardrooms, in courtrooms, in every backroom deal he's ever made. But in the public eye, that's different. Joe scoffed. You think a couple of headlines are going to stop a man like Carter? No, Harper admitted. But it'll slow him down. Owen's eyes sharpened. How? Harper took out her phone and dialed. Her contact in the press owed her a favor. She hadn't expected to cash it in like this. But desperate times, she arranged for an anonymous tip. A leak. By morning, the first article hit the internet. Edward Carter's latest real estate grab. A small town in Vermont fights back. And then the second. The man who owns everything. What happens when billionaires target your home? And then the third. Edward Carter's daughter takes a stand against him. But will it matter? Harper's stomach turned when she saw that last one. Because now Now it wasn't just about the town. Now, it was about her. Edward called that night. She shouldn't have answered, but she did. His voice was calm, controlled, but she knew him too well. Underneath the surface, he was seething. "Congratulations," he said smoothly. "You made the news." Harper's fingers curled around the phone. "You did that yourself." A beat of silence. Then, a chuckle. Not angry, worse, amused. "You think you're winning?" Edward asked. "You think a few headlines will stop me?" Harper's stomach twisted. "No, but they'll slow you down." Edward exhaled. "Oh, Harper, you still don't understand how this works, do you?" Harper swallowed. "Enlighten me." Edward's voice dropped to something colder. "You don't win by playing fair." The line went dead. And Harper, she had never been more afraid. Owen found her outside again that night. She was sitting on the porch, staring at the darkness. "Bad?" he asked. Harper let out a dry laugh. "Oh, just my father casually reminding me that he's a monster." Owen sat beside her. "What did he say?" Harper exhaled. "That I don't know how to win." Owen was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Do you?" Harper frowned. "What?" Owen turned to her. "Do you know how to win, Harper? Because your father's right about one thing. He doesn't play fair. So if you want to beat him, I have to stop playing by the rules." She finished. Owen nodded. Harper stared ahead because she knew what that meant. It meant crossing a line. It meant becoming something she wasn't sure she was ready to be. But if she didn't, they would lose everything. At dawn, Harper made another choice. She grabbed her phone and dialed the one person who might actually be able to help. "William," he answered on the second ring. "Harper," he sighed. "This is becoming a habit." Harper cut to the chase. "You said you knew how this ends. Tell me." William exhaled. "Your father isn't just buying the land, Harper. He's manipulating the banks. He's forcing debt. And when people can't pay, he swoops in like the hero with a buyout offer." Harper's breath hitched. "So he's creating a crisis," she whispered. William was silent for a beat, then, "Yeah." Harper's stomach twisted. "Can you prove it?" she asked. Another silence. Then, finally, "Maybe." Harper closed her eyes. This was it. This was the way to take him down. Not just expose him, destroy him. She swallowed. "Then let's make a deal." William chuckled. "You're more like your father than you think." Harper hated how much that stung, but she ignored it. Because now she had a plan. And Edward Carter, he wasn't ready for this. Harper had never thought of herself as ruthless. That had always been her father's role. Edward Carter didn't ask for things. He took them. He saw obstacles as temporary inconveniences, people as assets or liabilities, and morality as negotiable. Harper had spent her whole life fighting against that. But now she was about to use everything he taught her. And for the first time, she understood why her father always won. Because when you're willing to do anything, no one can stop you. William met her at an abandoned parking lot on the edge of town. Harper didn't tell Owen about this meeting. She knew he would never approve. But she wasn't asking for permission anymore. William leaned against his car, arms crossed, a lazy smirk on his face. "Harper Carter," he drawled. "Didn't think you'd actually go through with this." Harper didn't waste time. "Do you have what I asked for?" William chuckled. "You don't waste time, do you?" Harper's patience was gone. "William," he sighed, reaching into his jacket. "Relax, I brought it." He pulled out a flash drive and tossed it to her. Harper caught it, heart pounding. "You sure this is real?" she asked. William grinned. "Oh, sweetheart, this is as real as it gets." Harper plugged the drive into her phone. Files, documents, emails, all of it. Proof that Edward Carter had been manipulating the banks, forcing small businesses into financial ruin, making it impossible for them to stay afloat without his help. It was worse than she had imagined. This wasn't just unethical, it was illegal. Her father wasn't just buying the town. He was breaking it first. Harper's stomach turned. This was it. This was what she needed to end him. William watched her, his smirk never fading. "So what now?" he asked. Harper exhaled. "Now," she said. "We burn him to the ground." She went back to the farm before dawn. Owen was waiting for her. His arms were crossed, his expression unreadable. "Where were you?" Harper hesitated. Then she held up the flash drive. Owen's eyes narrowed. "What's that?" Harper took a deep breath. "It's how we win." Owen stared at her. Then he reached for the drive. Harper pulled it back. "Harper," he said slowly, "tell me where you got it." Her stomach twisted, because she knew how this would look, but she had to tell him. "It was from William," she admitted. Owen's entire body stiffened. "You went to William." Harper clenched her jaw. "I had to." Owen let out a bitter laugh. "You really think you can trust him?" Harper met his gaze. "I don't trust him. I trust the evidence." Owen exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Harper, I did what I had to do," she interrupted. Owen's jaw tightened. "Yeah," he muttered. "You did." And for the first time, it didn't sound like a compliment. Harper didn't have time to dwell on Owen's disappointment. Because the next move had already been set in motion, she sent the files to her contact in the press. This time, they didn't just run a story. They ran an investigation. National news picked it up. Suddenly, Edward Carter wasn't just a real estate mogul. He was a corrupt businessman under federal scrutiny. And Harper, she was the woman who exposed him. She knew the fallout would be immediate, but she wasn't prepared for how fast it came. That afternoon, Edward called. Harper didn't answer, so he sent someone else. Owen found her in the barn, his expression grim. "You need to see this," he said. Holding up his phone, Harper took it. Her stomach plummeted. It was a news clip. The headline, "Edward Carter's daughter betrays her own family," and the man giving the interview, William. Harper's blood ran cold. She pressed play. William was seated in a news studio, dressed in a sharp suit, looking every bit the perfect Carter protege, and the words coming out of his mouth, lies. "Harper Carter has always been reckless," he was saying. "She doesn't understand business, and she certainly doesn't understand loyalty." The reporter leaned in. "Are you saying she fabricated these accusations?" William gave a mocking smile. "I'm saying Harper Carter is trying to destroy her own father because she doesn't like the way he does business. She's not a whistleblower. She's a traitor." Harper's hands shook. Owen exhaled sharply. "He set you up." Harper swallowed hard. "Yes, he did." Her father called again. "This time," she answered. "Well," Edward said smoothly. "That backfired, didn't it?" Harper's heart pounded. "You sent him." Edward chuckled. "Oh, sweetheart, I didn't have to. You walked right into it." Harper's throat tightened. She had thought she was being smart, but she had played exactly into her father's hands. "You don't win by playing fair," Edward continued. "You should have learned that by now." Harper's fingers curled around the phone. "You think this is over," she whispered. Edward sighed, like she was a child who just wouldn't listen. "Harper, you lost. The public will always believe power over principle. And right now, I still have power." Harper's vision blurred with anger. "But you're scared," she shot back. A beat of silence. Then Edward's voice dropped to something dangerous. "Be very careful, Harper." The line went dead. Harper lowered the phone, shaking. Owen was watching her. His voice was softer now. "What do we do?" Harper took a slow, shaky breath. She wasn't done. She wasn't giving up. Her father wanted to play dirty. Fine. She had spent her whole life learning from the best. Now, she was about to beat him at his own game. Harper lifted her gaze, and for the first time she smiled. "We make our next move." Harper Carter had spent her whole life playing by the rules. And for what? To be betrayed? To be discredited? To watch her father win again? Not this time. Edward Carter had made one critical mistake. He thought this was over. But Harper, she was just getting started. She didn't sleep that night. Instead, she sat at the kitchen table, staring at the news article on her phone. Harper Carter's attempt to destroy her father backfires. The media had swallowed William's lies without hesitation. And Edward, he had made sure the story stuck. Harper was the villain, a spoiled daughter with a grudge, a woman with daddy issues, not a whistleblower, not someone to take seriously. The town had started to doubt her, and that was the worst part. Because for the first time, she had people who believed in her, people who had trusted her. And now, because of her father's games, that trust was cracking. She had one shot to fix it, and she wasn't going to waste it. The next morning, Harper made 2 phone calls. The first was to a lawyer. The second was to a hacker. "You're insane," Owen muttered as he leaned against the truck, watching Harper pace. Harper shot him a look. "No, I'm adapting." Owen sighed. "You're really doing this?" Harper stopped walking. "Do you have a better idea?" Owen hesitated. That was answer enough. The lawyer was a former corporate bulldog, the kind of man who knew every loophole Edward Carter had ever used, and he knew how to turn them against him. Harper met him at a small office in town. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I need to take my father down," she said. The lawyer exhaled, flipping through the files she had brought. "That's a tall order." Harper's fingers curled into fists. "Can you do it?" The lawyer met her gaze. Then, after a long pause, he nodded. The hacker was a wild card, a woman named Nina. No last name, no address, just a phone number and a reputation for being able to crack into anything. Harper met her in a dingy diner on the outskirts of town. Nina took one look at Harper and smirked. "Let me guess. Daddy issues." Harper didn't rise to the bait. "Can you do the job or not?" Nina leaned back, sipping her coffee. "Depends." Harper clenched her jaw. "On what?" Nina's smirk widened. "How much fun it's gonna be." By nightfall, the plan was in motion. Harper had learned from her father. He didn't fight clean. So now, neither would she. Owen found her on the porch later that night. "You sure about this?" he asked quietly. Harper stared at the dark horizon. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." Owen studied her for a moment. Then he nodded. And just like that, they were all in. The first strike came at dawn. It started with a leak. Nina had done her job too well. Files, real ones, flooded the internet. Bank transactions, emails, contracts, all signed by Edward Carter, all proving his guilt. And this time, there was no William to spin the story. Because Harper had been smart, she hadn't just leaked it to the press. She had leaked it to law enforcement, to government agencies, to people who couldn't ignore it. Within hours, the headlines changed. Edward Carter under investigation for financial crimes. Leaked documents expose corrupt deals. Harper Carter was right, and she has the receipts. Harper sat on Owen's couch, watching the news roll in. Owen sat beside her, silent. Then he turned to her, a slow grin spreading across his face. "You actually did it," Harper exhaled. Not yet, because she knew her father, and he wasn't done fighting. The retaliation came fast. By noon, her bank accounts were frozen. By 2, her phone number was disconnected. And by 5, a black SUV pulled up outside the farm. Owen tensed beside her. "Stay here." Harper ignored him and walked outside. The driver's door opened, and Edward Carter stepped out. For the first time, they were face to face. No boardrooms, no lawyers, no distractions. Just father and daughter. Edward took off his sunglasses, surveying the farm with thinly veiled contempt. "Well," he said, "you've been busy." Harper's heart pounded. She forced herself to stand tall. "Someone had to be." Edward sighed. "Do you even understand what you've done?" Harper's jaw clenched. "I exposed you." Edward tilted his head. "No, sweetheart. You destroyed yourself." Harper swallowed. "You don't scare me." Edward chuckled. "You should be scared, because I'm about to show you what happens when you cross me." Owen stepped forward. Then, his presence was solid, unyielding. Edward barely glanced at him. Then he looked back at Harper. "You think he can protect you?" Harper's stomach twisted, because she knew her father, and she knew what he meant. This wasn't about her anymore. This was about Owen, about the town, about everyone she had dragged into this fight. Edward leaned in, voice low. "This is war." "Harper." Harper's pulse pounded, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she smiled. "Then you better be ready to lose." Edward exhaled, shaking his head. "You really don't know who you're dealing with." Harper's smile widened. "Neither do you." Edward left, but Harper knew. The real battle was about to begin. Edward Carter wasn't the type of man who lost. Harper had spent her whole life watching him win. Every deal, every fight, every war. And now, for the first time, he was losing, and she knew he would do anything to change that. The next morning, the escalation began. Owen's farm was raided, Not by hired thugs. By government officials, armed with warrants. Anonymous tip, one of them said, handing over the paperwork. Fraud, tax evasion, possible illegal land use. Harper's blood ran cold. This was her father's move. He couldn't silence her. So now, he was going after Owen. The town turned out in full force. Farmers, business owners, families. They watched, stunned, as government agents combed through Owen's land, confiscating files, measuring property lines, checking records. "Nobody believes this," Joe said under his breath, standing beside Harper. Harper swallowed. That's not the point. The point was distraction. The point was control. Edward Carter was showing her. If she fought him, innocent people would suffer. Owen stood beside her, silent. His entire life was being picked apart in front of him. And it was her fault. "Owen, not now," he said, his voice tight. Harper's stomach twisted because she had made a choice. And now, Owen was paying for it. By sunset, the agents left. No arrests, no charges, just damage. A clear warning. This is what happens when you go against Edward Carter. Owen was still silent as they watched the last car drive away. Harper turned to him. "Owen, don't," he said. His voice was flat. "Dead." Harper felt her chest tighten. "We'll fix this." Owen let out a breath, and when he finally looked at her, there was something broken in his eyes. "Will we?" Harper's throat tightened. She wanted to say yes. She wanted to tell him everything would be fine, but she wasn't sure if it was true. The silence between them stretched for days. Owen threw himself into work. Harper threw herself into strategy, because if her father was going after Owen, it meant he was desperate. It meant she was close. The final move came 2 nights later. A fire. Harper woke to the sound of screaming. She ran outside, heart pounding, breath short, and then she saw it. Owen's barn, burning. Owen was already there, shouting orders, dragging out horses, trying to control the chaos. Flames licked the sky, turning the night into a nightmare. Harper ran toward him. What happened? Owen didn't stop working. Arson. Harper's stomach dropped. She turned, searching for answers, searching for proof, and then she saw it. A man in the distance, dressed in black, watching. Then, disappearing. It took hours to put out the fire. By morning, the barn was gone. The damage was catastrophic. Harper stood next to Owen, staring at the ruins. Her chest was tight. "This was him," she whispered. Owen exhaled. "Yeah." Harper turned to him. "We have to end this." Owen finally met her gaze, and for the first time since it all started, he didn't look angry. He looked ready. "Then let's finish it." Harper made one last call. She didn't call the press. She didn't call the government. She called her father. He answered after one ring. "Harper," Edward said smoothly. "You've been busy." Harper's pulse pounded. "You burned his barn." Edward sighed. "Do you have proof?" Harper clenched her jaw. "I don't need proof, I know it was you." Edward chuckled. "Then what are you going to do about it?" Harper took a slow, steady breath, and then she gave him a choice. "You back off," she said. "You leave this town alone. You walk away, and I won't go through with this." Edward's voice was amused. "Go through with what?" Harper smiled. "You'll find out soon enough." For the first time, there was a pause, a hesitation. Then, Edward sighed. "You're bluffing." Harper's grip tightened on the phone. "Try me." The final move was already in place. Harper had been one step ahead, because while Edward had been burning barns and sending threats, Harper had been digging, and she had found something. A weakness. Her father's empire wasn't untouchable. It had a crack, and she had just enough leverage to break it apart. That night, the truth came out. Leaked documents, anonymous sources, the real Edward Carter, exposed, not just for corruption, for fraud, for bribery, for federal crimes. And this time, there was no spinning it. By morning, the headlines were everywhere. Edward Carter under federal investigation, criminal charges pending. Carter Industries faces collapse after shocking revelations. The king has fallen. Harper stood in the kitchen, watching the news. Her father's face was plastered across every screen. Owen walked in, coffee in hand. He raised an eyebrow. So? He said. That's it. Harper exhaled. Yeah, she murmured. That's it. Owen smirked. You really took down Edward Carter? Harper let out a breath. I guess I did. Her phone rang. She knew who it was. She answered. Silence, then. Her father's voice. Congratulations, Edward said. Harper's pulse pounded. You lost. A beat of silence. Then, Edward chuckled. Did I? Harper's grip tightened on the phone. And in that moment, she knew. Edward Carter wasn't done. Not yet. Edward Carter had lost, at least. That's what the world thought. Harper had done the impossible. She had brought him down. His empire was crumbling. His reputation was shattered, and the legal system was finally closing in. The man who had spent his life controlling everything was now at the mercy of forces he couldn't manipulate. But Harper knew better. Her father wasn't the kind of man who accepted defeat. He was the kind of man who waited for the right moment to strike back. And that moment, it was coming. She could feel it. The day after the news broke, Harper sat on the porch staring at the endless stretch of Owen's land. She should have felt relieved. She should have felt victorious. Instead, she felt exhausted, because even though her father was falling, she knew this wasn't over. Not yet. Owen stepped outside, coffee in hand. You haven't slept, he said, sitting next to her. Harper exhaled. How could I? Owen took a sip of his coffee, watching her carefully. He's done, Harper. He has no power left. Harper turned to him, her voice quiet. You don't know my father. Owen frowned. Then tell me. Harper stared down at her hands. Edward Carter doesn't fight battles, she said. He ends them. If he thinks there's even a chance that I could ruin him forever, he won't stop. Owen studied her. You're scared. Harper swallowed hard. For the first time in weeks, she let herself admit it. Yeah, the attack came that night. Not physical, financial. At exactly midnight. Harper's phone buzzed. She grabbed it, blinking at the screen. It was an alert. Her accounts had been wiped. Every cent. Gone. A second alert followed. Her name had been blacklisted in every major financial institution connected to Carter Industries. She had no access, no money, no resources. Harper's stomach twisted. This was her father's message. If he was going down, he was taking her with him. The next morning, the calls started. Her lawyer, her contacts, her last remaining allies, all saying the same thing. Edward Carter had played his final hand. He had turned everything against her. Made sure no company would ever work with her again. Made sure her name was ruined. And now she was just as powerless as he was. Harper sat at the kitchen table, staring at the phone. Owen stood near the sink, arms crossed. You knew this was coming, he said. Harper nodded. I just didn't think it would happen this fast. Owen pulled out a chair, sitting across from her. Can you stop him? Harper exhaled. Not this time. Owen frowned. So what do we do? Harper closed her eyes. Then finally, she made a decision. She called him, the man who had built her, the man who had tried to destroy her. Edward Carter. He answered after one ring. Hello, Harper, he said, voice smooth as ever. Harper's pulse pounded. You took everything. Edward sighed. You took everything first. Harper clenched her jaw. You want me to beg, don't you? Edward chuckled. No, sweetheart. I just want you to understand. Understand what? Edward's voice dropped lower. You can fight me. You can try to ruin me. But at the end of the day, I'm still your father. Harper swallowed hard, because she knew what he was really saying. She would always be a Carter. And in the world Edward Carter had built, that meant something. Harper sat in silence for a long moment. Then she whispered, I'm not like you. Edward exhaled. No, he said softly, but you're learning. And then the line went dead. The next day, the headlines changed. Edward Carter was officially under federal indictment. His empire had fallen. But Harper, she wasn't sure if she had one, because the cost. It had been everything, her reputation, her money, her name. She had wanted to take her father down, and she had. But now, she had nothing left. Owen found her later that night. You okay? Harper let out a breath. I don't know. Owen sat beside her. You're free, he said. Harper turned to him. Am I? Owen studied her for a moment. Then, quietly, he said, You don't have to be your father's daughter anymore. Harper swallowed hard, because for the first time, she realized he was right. She had spent so long fighting Edward Carter, so long trying to prove she wasn't like him. And now she had the chance to be someone else, someone new. The next morning, she packed a bag, not for New York, for somewhere else. She didn't know where yet. She just knew. She wasn't going back. Owen stood by the truck, watching her. "You sure about this?" he asked. Harper nodded. "For the first time in my life." "Yeah," Owen smirked. "So that's it, you're just leaving." Harper smiled. "No." Then she tossed her bag in the truck and kissed him, slow, certain. And for the first time, it wasn't about defiance. It wasn't about rebellion. It was about her, choosing something for herself when they pulled apart. Owen grinned. "Guess I'll have to come with you then." Harper smirked. "Guess you will." And just like that, they drove into the unknown, together, free. End of chapter 16, 2,000 words. Finale, the reckoning. Edward Carter fell. Harper Carter rose. And in the end, she didn't just defeat him. She walked away from him. From the past, from the name, from the war, and she built something new, something real. Because in the end, Harper Carter didn't just win. She chose her own future.